The Biden administration threw Israel under the bus at the UN Security Council, and then it denied having done so. And Donald Trump issued a warning for Israel that we need to understand. I'll have details on both coming up on In Focus. On Monday, the Biden administration abstained from a UN Security Council vote on Resolution 2728 relating to Hamas's war against Israel in Gaza. And by abstaining, it allowed it to pass. A lot of people think, well, if they abstain, how can you say that they supported it? Because the United States is really the only bar between the UN condemning Israel's very existence and the existence of the State of Israel. It has a veto. And generally, as a matter of course, the United States, under successive administrations, used its veto in order to bar anti-Israel resolutions that would, in a significant way, undermine Israel's ability to defend itself against its enemies from passing. So if you abstain, you allow something to pass, which means that you support it, which is what the United States did. Now, what is the resolution that the United States supported? The United States would like us all to believe that there's nothing wrong with the United States would like us to believe that there's nothing wrong with a resolution that it abstained from. And here I just want to show you what John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesman, said yesterday following Israel's condemnations of the U.S. action. Let's watch it for a second.
Today, as you all know, we abstained on a UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza till the end of Ramadan and the release of all the hostages. Our vote does not, I repeat, does not represent a shift in our policy. We've been very clear, we've been very consistent in our support for a ceasefire as part of a hostage deal.
So what is Kirby saying here? What Kirby is saying is, look, there's no change in our position. By the way, just what he said is exactly the same thing that Matthew Miller, the State Department spokesman, said. There's been no change in our position. So this is incorrect. And first thing that you need to do is just look at the resolution to understand what it says. So the resolution, in the operative part of it, every UN resolution starts off with a sort of preamble that puts it into a context of previous actions by the UN Security Council, etc. And then it goes into the operative part of the resolution where it says what it wants to do now. So the first paragraph in the operative part of Resolution 2728 says this, that the UN Security Council, quote, demands an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, the Islamic holy month of Ramadan, respected by all parties, leading to a lasting, sustainable ceasefire, and also demands the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as well as ensuring humanitarian access to address their medical and other humanitarian needs, and further demands that the parties comply with their obligations under international law in relation to all persons they detain. So on the one hand, it demands an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, respected by all parties, leading to a lasting, sustainable ceasefire. And then on the other hand, it also demands the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. So the United States would like us to believe that that means that there's some sort of a condition put in here to the ceasefire only if the hostages are released. At least that was the American position until Monday, March 25th, that any ceasefire had to be contingent on the release of hostages. But here there is no if this, then that. In other words, if the hostages are released, then you get a ceasefire. No. It demands a ceasefire, and it also demands the release of the hostages. So both of them have equal weight, and both of them have to happen now. So the ceasefire under this resolution is in no way, shape, or form connected to the release of the hostages. They just happen to be in the same paragraph, but there's no connection between the two. You need a ceasefire, full stop, and you need the hostages to be released, full stop. But one can happen without the other. And since Hamas, by the way, isn't a member of the UN, when really the demands make no difference to Hamas, because Hamas doesn't have to abide by anything the UN says, since it's not a member of the UN. So none of the demands on Hamas are completely immaterial, and the demands on Israel are material. You have to immediately have a ceasefire. So this is a complete change in American policy. Again, to date, the United States said that a ceasefire was contingent on release of hostages. For instance, we had the ceasefire in November during the hostages for terrorists and ceasefire swap, where we got 110 hostages released, the children and some of the women released over a period of many days. It was several weeks. I can't even remember how long it was. It might have been 30 days. It might have been a little bit less. But we had the hostages released. And at the same time that they were being released, we had a ceasefire. And that's what was the American position. That was Israel's position. We accepted that we would release 3 terrorists for every hostage that they released, and that during the course of the hostage release, it was, I think, 12 days actually, that we would not conduct military operations in Gaza, and we didn't. Hamas continued to organize its troops, reorganize its command and control and everything like that. So they were actually building up and getting ready for the next stage, and Israeli forces on the ground in Gaza were effectively sitting ducks. All the same, Israel did not operate during the ceasefire, and we fulfilled our part of the deal. It ended up collapsing because Hamas did not fulfill its part in the deal. It didn't release all of the women that it had agreed to do, etc. So that's why it collapsed at the end of the period of the release of 110 hostages from Gaza. But that was the American position. That was the Israeli position. You want a ceasefire? Give us back our hostages. And here we have a completely different position that the United States accepted by abstaining from UN Security Council Resolution 2728. But we have the United States then gaslighting Israel. There was no change in our position. We want a ceasefire. No, there was a complete change in your position. And Israelis weren't the only ones who noticed it. Hamas also noticed it. Because if until the United States has abstained from the vote at the Security Council, Hamas knew that it could only secure a ceasefire of any kind if it agreed to release hostages, they suddenly said, okay, we're not going to be part of any of the deal. We don't accept any of the conditions that are being put on the deal. Let's just talk for a second. What is the deal that the United States and Hamas, that the United States has been mediating between Hamas and Israel? Right, there are negotiations now going on in Doha. The head of the Mossad is in Doha, representing Israel in these hostage release negotiations. And the deal that was on the table, reportedly, was that Hamas would release 40 of our hostages, including all of the women, including the female soldiers that they're holding, and sick and elderly. That they would let out 40 out of the 130 hostages that they're holding. And since about 30 of the hostages are presumed dead, so then they would continue to hold around 60 apparently live hostages after this deal. So that this isn't even a deal to secure the lives and the release of all hostages, just 40 of them. Okay? And in exchange, Israel was going to reportedly agreed to the release of 700 terrorists from our prison, including 100 terrorists that are serving life sentences because they've been convicted of murder. So 100 murderers get out, along with 600 other convicted terrorists who are sitting in jail for lesser offenses than murder. And in exchange, you're supposed to get 40 hostages out alive. Okay, and during the course of that hostages for terrorist swap, there's supposed to be something like a 30-day ceasefire. Right, so that's a deal that was on the table until the United States abstained and enabled the passage of a UN Security Council resolution that makes that does not condition a ceasefire on the release of hostages. And then suddenly, Hamas says, first of all, they welcomed the resolution, as well they would, as did the Iranians. They welcomed this Russian, Chinese. Drafted or sponsored resolution in the UN Security Council, which you would have expected them to do, and Hamas welcomed it, and Hamas responded by withdrawing what apparently was its previous willingness to consider this hostages for terrorists and ceasefire swap that was on the table in Paris and in Doha, etc. that Israel was willing, reportedly, to accept to get our hostages out. And really what Hamas's move signaled is that because the United States changed its policy, contrary to what John Kirby and Matt Miller at the State Department and other American spokesmen would say, the United States changed its policy, made the release of hostages no longer a condition for a ceasefire. There is actually no longer any, apparently, I would argue that there is no longer a diplomatic path towards freeing the hostages. The only way, after what the United States did to release the hostages that Hamas is holding, including several Americans, is through military action by Israel. That's the only way, because the United States' move just vacated any chance of a diplomatic deal being reached between Israel and Hamas. We have nothing to offer them. The United States just gave them a ceasefire for nothing. So why should they pay with the coinage of hostages that they're holding in order to get something that they already received for nothing? So now the only way to release the hostages is for Israel to go in and save them. So thank you very much, the United States of America. President Biden promised, right, when he came to Israel. He promised when he came to Israel in October. He promised at his State of the Union address when he spoke to the families of hostages who he invited to Congress to sit and listen to his speech, that he would not abandon the hostages, that he was fighting for the hostages, that the United States was committed to their release. He just broke his word completely by abstaining from this resolution that delinks a ceasefire from the release of hostages, meaning that the only way for hostages to be released is for Israel to go in and free them. That's it. There's no other way. It's only a military solution now. There's no longer any diplomatic path forward for releasing the hostages, thanks to the change in the Biden administration's position vis-a-vis Israel and Hamas, as manifested in its abstention at the UN Security Council on Monday. And that, I think, is very important for us to understand. And now that the United States has ruled out anything other than a military operation to free hostages, a continuation of the military effort by Israel to free our hostages, what else have they done? Well, the day before the vote, Kamala Harris gave her interview, I think it was to ABC News, where she said that if Israel continues on with its military operation to destroy Hamas's military infrastructure in Gaza, including its remaining 4 battalions that are holed down in Rafah, through a ground invasion of Rafah, that she could not rule out consequences for Israel.
We've been very clear that it would be a mistake to move into Rafah with any type of military operation.
A mistake, but would there be consequences if he does move forward?
Well, we're going to take it one step at a time, but we've been very clear in terms of our perspective on whether or not that should happen.
Are you ruling out that there would be consequences from the United States?
I am ruling out nothing.
Well, we can believe her because there keep being consequences for Israel not bowing out and accepting defeat at the hands of Hamas from the American perspective. Every day there's an escalation in American rhetoric. There's an escalation in American animosity towards Israel. I think we talked about it last week, that the United States wants to build this port in Gaza, that they're handing over to the control of the Hamas-controlled contractor, the Al-Sisi Corporation, Hissi Corporation, which is controlled by Hamas, which is Hamas's main contractor for infrastructure work in Gaza, including, presumably, their main infrastructure in Gaza, which is the 400 miles of tunnels that Gaza used. All of the cement that the international donors brought into Gaza to rebuild Gaza, they used that cement and concrete in order to build 400 miles of underground tunnels. So the United States, first, now they want to build a port. They want Hamas's contractor to build the port. They want Hamas's state sponsor, Qatar, to pay for the port. And they're threatening consequences, further malign action by the United States, further hostile action by the United States, whether on the ground in Gaza or in the diplomatic circles or wherever, or in economic levels, wherever it happens to be, if Israel conducts the ground operation in Rafah that's required in order to secure military victory in this war, and thanks to the United States' action at the Security Council to secure the release of our hostages, then Israel will face consequences. In other words, the United States just blocked any diplomatic solution, if you will, to the war with Hamas by siding with Hamas at the Security Council and blocking any non-military path for the rescue of the hostages. And at the same time, the United States has set Israel up for a major crisis in relations and payback consequences, as Vice President Kamala Harris made clear, if Israel does, in fact, move towards a military resolution of the war with Israeli victory. So diplomatic path has now been shut off by the United States at the UN, and a diplomatic path the United States is trying to shut off by undermining and denying that Israel has the right to continue to prosecute the war to victory by taking Rafah. And again, just to remind, we talk about this all the time because the thing has been put off for so many weeks that we keep repeating ourselves. Why is it so important for Israel to conquer Rafah? It's important for two reasons. One is because, as John Spencer, the head of the West Point Urban Warfare Institute, said on this show a couple of weeks ago, that Hamas it carries out acts of terrorism, but it's an army. When it invaded Israel on October 7th, it had a 30,000-man army that was well-trained, divided into units, into regular fighting units, light infantry units, artillery units, missile units, cyber warfare units, etc. Right? And it invaded Israel with the strength of a division. And it took territory, and it used its control over territory in order to carry out a slaughter, the likes of which we hadn't seen since the Holocaust, and in many areas that we hadn't even seen in the Holocaust in terms of the barbarism and the utter sadism of the slaughter. So that was a regular army mission, and the war that Israel has been fighting in Gaza has been much more of a conventional struggle of a military against a military than it has been a counterterrorism operation of the kind that we've seen in places like Mosul or Fallujah or Afghanistan, or even in previous iterations of Israel's war with Hamas in Gaza and with Hamas and the Palestinian Authority and Islamic Jihad as well in Judea and Samaria. This is an army against an army. And Hamas army has 4 remaining battalions intact in Rafah, and in order to secure a military victory, Israel has to take apart those battalions, destroy them piece by piece, as it's destroyed the other Hamas battalions and other engagements, whether in Khan Yunis or in Deir al-Balah or Beit Hanun or anywhere else, right? So that's what we need to do. And then once we do that, we can get to a lower intensity phase of the war, which is the counter-terror phase of the war. Once Israel takes over Gaza physically, by ending the conventional phase of the battle, by destroying Hamas's military, then Israel can move to the more what would be more reminiscent of a counterterrorism operation. We've seen this, for instance, over the past 2 weeks at Shifa Hospital in northern Gaza, in Gaza City, where Israel went in initially in November, and then after we left Shifa, we uncovered their tunnel complex in some of the buildings, and we found a lot of military materiel. In that hospital, we saw evidence. We were able to show evidence that they had taken hostages into Shifa Hospital, and they had held hostages, including babies, inside of the hospital. So we know that the hospital was, in fact, used as Hamas's terror headquarters. But then the Hamas terrorists fled Shifa in one of the humanitarian pauses or another to a humanitarian safe zone, and then they came back. They came back apparently through tunnels that Israel hadn't uncovered yet, and they're not wearing uniforms most of the time now, when they already have their weapons pre-positioned so they can wander around above ground without weapons, and then they go in and they take their weapons because they know where they are, and Israel still hasn't found most of them, apparently. So Israel went back into Shifa Hospital on March 17th, and this was a counterterrorism raid, right? We went in at dawn when they weren't expecting us. And within, several days, we had arrested or killed over 1,000 terrorists. And, then they said, Israel kills 1,000 people in Gaza. Well, no, but we did arrest that, I don't know how many hundreds of terrorists, and we killed a bunch of others. And they added up to the same number that the Hamas Ministry of Health said that we had killed. So that was the Shifa operation, and we found massive amounts of arms in Shifa, hidden in maternity wards and the MRI wards, the burn unit. They're shooting mortars from the maternity ward at IDF forces, et cetera, et cetera. So we've seen some really hard fighting in Shifa, but this is a counter-terrorist operation. This isn't the conventional operation in which Israel initially seized Shifa Hospital, but this is a kind of long slog that Israel will enter into in Gaza, all over Gaza, once Israel takes Rafah. But we need to first destroy their conventional forces, and the remaining conventional forces are in Rafah. And I would argue, just as importantly, if not more importantly, from a strategic perspective, it's not just the battalions that Israel has to take. Rafah is located along the international border with Egypt. So long as Hamas controls an international border, it will be able to continue to rebuild its strength through its subterranean tunnel things, through smuggling networks of their allies in Egypt, Sinai Peninsula, et cetera, et cetera. So Israel needs to take out Rafah in order to win the war. It's very, very simple. So the United States blocks diplomatic avenues of concluding the war through negotiated ceasefire in exchange for the hostages on the one side, and on the other side it says you're going to wreck your relationship with the United States now that we've offered you no venue for operations other than military. If you engage in that venue, if you go down that road, then you're going to undermine your relations with the United States. So that's the choice that the United States is now presenting Israel with. Anything that you do to try to win the war is going to undermine your relations with the United States. Now go figure out what you're going to do. Well, the Israelis decided what we were going to do. They go into Rafah. So I think that's very important. We've set up the humanitarian safe zone along what's called the Mawasi on the coast. And, Israel will be setting up tents there and everything like that for the civilians. And they'll be able to go there and we'll be able to operate in Rafah. That's just how it goes. It's just a matter of time. Why is it taking so long? Well, it's taken so long because Israel, until Monday, when the United States did what it did at the Security Council, was trying very hard to persuade the Biden administration to support us, to continue to support us, or to renew the support that it has rescinded from Israel, so that when we enter into this decisive phase of the conventional war in Gaza, that we'll do so with American support. And what they did in the UN is said, now you don't have it anymore. So, people are questioning whether Prime Minister Netanyahu was right when he responded to the American abstention at the UN Security Council by canceling the delegation that he was about to send to Washington to discuss America's objections to Israel's planned ground operation in Rafah or not. We were supposed to see him send Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer and National Security Advisor Tzafi Hanegbi to Washington to talk to their U.S. counterparts. They were essentially summoned to Washington to do so by Blinken, by Secretary of State Blinken and President Biden and all the rest of them, because the United States wanted to, call them on the carpet and say, you're not allowed to go into Rafah. And then they were supposed to plead their case saying, please, Your Majesty, this is why we need to do it, and please support us, and hopefully convince them. But the minute that the Biden administration abstained at the UN Security Council, it's clear that there's nobody to talk to. So Netanyahu said, no, we're not going to send you guys. I'm not sending you guys to Washington. I'm not sending my delegation. And therefore, because there's no point. That's what he said. That was essentially the message that he communicated, that what you did shows that there's really no point. You don't care about proof. You don't care about evidence. You've decided to go down this road. Okay, so you're there. Fine. I mean, we just have to do what we have to do in order to win, and that's what we're going to do, which he said that earlier this week or last week. I can't remember anymore. He said, look, we want the United States to support us going into Rafah, but whether they support us or not, we're going in. And I think that's very, very much the case. I mean, and of course, just to get a little tiny bit. So, we have Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, is in Washington now. It was, planned because the United States was saying that they were going to withhold further armaments to Israel. Unfortunately, the House still has not passed the proposed 14.3 or 13.4, $14.3 billion in arms that Biden had promised to Israel already back in October. It passed through the Senate, but it passed through with Ukraine aid, and so you have people in the House who don't want to pass Ukraine aid, and so it's all being held. So anyway, it hasn't passed yet, but which is pretty bad for Israel. But Gallant went there this week because the administration said, well, you have to commit to us in writing that all the weapons that we send you, you're going to use in accordance with international law, which of course Israel does. And so it's just a way to humiliate us. And Gallant went and he signed the piece of paper, said, yes, we abide by international humanitarian law, duh. And he's there now. I mean, he can talk to them as much as he wants, but the policy set by the prime minister is a policy of Israel. We have to go into Rafah. And by the way, Gallant has said that as well. And that'll be the end of that. When you're looking at this, a lot of people in Israel are seeing the American presidential election, seeing that Biden seems to be just transfixed by the Muslim vote in Michigan, even though, according to a poll that I saw, I think it was CNN, Trump was leading Biden in Michigan by, I don't know, was it 20 points or something like that? And it was all attributed to the United Auto Workers Union that views Biden as its enemy, as the enemy of the auto industry, rightly, because of the mandates that he put on electric vehicles, which Americans don't want. So all the lines are going bankrupt because they're putting out these cars that the United States hasn't set up the infrastructure to sustain. You don't have the charging stations for them. It's too expensive, whatever the case may be. The repairs are expensive. People don't like them. They want to have their gasoline engines that they always had. They're much more reliable. And again, you have the infrastructure there in the United States already set up for them, something that you don't have apparently for mass production of electronic vehicles. At any rate, the UAW is very, very angry at Biden, and that's why he's losing. It's got nothing to do with Muslims. We talked about this at length a few weeks ago, that the Muslim vote really isn't that big of a deal. And by the way, if push comes to shove and they're faced with a Trump presidency, that they'll, in all likelihood, put their fingers on their nose and go vote for Biden. It's like most responsible voters do when they're faced with a choice between something that they can't accept and something that is minimally acceptable. So, Biden is going along and saying elections, elections, elections. And so Israelis naturally are looking at Donald Trump, former President Donald Trump, and saying, are you going to get elected? Is it possible that we're going to see a second Trump presidency? And hoping very much that we will. Most Israelis really do prefer to have a pro-Israel president than a pro-Hamas president. Most Israelis prefer to have a pro-Israel president to a pro-Hamas president. Go figure. And Trump gave an interview, I think it was on Friday, that was just broadcast yesterday to Israel's newspaper, Israel Hayom, where he answered a lot of questions about his view of Israel, his record on Israel, and how he views, the state of American-Israel relations, etc., with Israel Hayom. And when he was president, as he said in this interview, he was the most pro-Israel president in history. And not only did he recognize that Jerusalem is Israel's capital, he opened up the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, which was really a watershed moment in Middle East history and opened up the path for the Abraham Accords. He also recognized Israeli sovereignty in the Golan Heights, which was extremely important for undermining Iran's web of proxy armies surrounding Israel. It was a very important move. It also had economic implications for Israel, which were very important. So American recognition of Israeli sovereignty was very important. And as he stated, the most important thing, arguably, from a strategic perspective that he did, that helped Israel and helped the United States as well, is that he left Obama's disastrous nuclear deal with Iran from 2015. It took him a while, but he did vacate U.S. signature to the JCPOA, so-called, and towards the end of his presidency, he went full-on implementing crippling economic sanctions on Iran. And he talked about the severe economic ramifications of his move on Iran in that interview with Yisrael Hayom. And what he said was absolutely true. He said that he crippled the Iranian economy. They didn't have the money. Their foreign reserves were almost gone by the time he left office. And Iran simply didn't have the money to fund its proxy armies, Hezbollah, Hamas. It's not that they were starving or anything like that. They did have weapons, but they didn't have the weapons and they didn't have the economic confidence or the strategic confidence in Iran that they needed in order to go forward with the invasion of October 7th. So in that sense, everything that he said was absolutely correct. His policies on Israel were tremendous. They stabilized the region in a way that it hadn't been stabilized in many, many decades. and opened up an era of peace with the Abraham Accords. His policy here was extremely successful, and it was predicated on strong U.S. support for Israel. By the way, he also recognized that the Israeli communities beyond the Green Line, beyond the 1949 armistice lines, are legal under international law. This was also important. His deal of the century was not liked by many Israelis on the right because it involved the establishment of a Palestinian state, but it also recognized Israel's sovereignty over sections of Judea and Samaria, and this was also a watershed moment in U.S.-Israel relations and in American strategic sanity vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinians that, if he had been reelected, would have had powerful repercussions and ripple effects throughout the region, expanding the circle of peace and ensuring Israel's security for decades to come through a very strong U.S.-Israel alliance, which would have deterred not only Israel's foes, but America's foes, first and foremost Iran, in its effort to acquire nuclear weapons and to assert regional hegemony. So that was all true. But, one of the things that we found throughout his 4 years in office was that there was a gap between extraordinary policies on the one hand and rhetoric on the other hand that oftentimes fell short and was easy to criticize by Trump's enemies at home, and that they would use his rhetoric time after time in order to try to allege or assert that he was anti-Semitic, that he was sympathetic towards anti-Semites or whatever. And liberal Jews, I think to their shame, played into this game, refused to compare what he did to what he said, and tried to catch him up in a lot of inelegant statements in order to prove that he was an enemy of the Jews, when the exact opposite was the case. I mean, just look at the executive order that he signed, I think it was in December 2019, that provided the Civil Rights Act's protection to Jewish students on college campuses. Imagine if a Trump appointee was now Secretary of Education, in this tsunami of Jew hatred that we see from coast to coast in campuses. It would have been a completely different situation. That executive order, while it wasn't canceled by Joe Biden, it hasn't been implemented by the Biden administration's education department. And so Jews find themselves attacked every day brutally on campus. You see Columbia University, my alma mater, I'm embarrassed to say, had a recruiting event this week for Palestinian terrorist organizations, designated Palestinian terrorist organizations and their front groups on campus. And this was sanctioned, and nothing is going to happen to Columbia University, I dare say, as a result of them transforming campus into this kind of terrorism recruitment center. But so Trump made all of these points at his in his interview with Israel Hayom, or he made these policies actually during his administration. But he also said something that has caused a lot of people to worry inside of Israel, people who really want Trump to win. And I just want to play this clip for you real quick of what he said, because it's very important to understand it, I think.
You have to finish up your war. You have to finish it up. You got to get it done. And I'm sure you'll do that. And we got to get to peace. You can't have this going on. And I will say Israel has to be very careful, because you're losing a lot of the world. You're losing a lot of support. But you have to finish up. You have to get the job done. And you have to get on to peace. You have to get on to a normal life for Israel and for everybody else.
So what does that mean? Ariel Kahana, one of the reporters from Israel Hayom who interviewed him, said on Channel 14 on the news the other day, he said, look, the thing, I went in there thinking that he was going to come out and support Israel's operation in Rafah, that he was going to give full-throated support for what we're doing in Gaza, tell us to demolish Hamas, etc. And he didn't say that. And we gave him opportunity after opportunity to say those things, and he chose deliberately not to. Instead, he said, you have to finish up this war very quickly and start a peace process going. And Kahana, I think he resonated the fears of many Israelis. I mean, we know that there's no chance of peace. It's utterly delusional, and it's delusional as well to think that you can have a Palestinian state that wouldn't pose an existential threat to Israel after October 7th. And, 80% support that Hamas and the actions that it took, the atrocities it carried out on October 7th, receives the support of 80% of Palestinians, both in Judea and Samaria and in Gaza. This is a big deal, right? So the fact that Trump didn't give that kind of full-throated support for Israel's war effort was really troubling to Israelis. And I think that it should be troubling to Israelis, but it tells us something. It tells us two things, actually, that are really important to point out now so that both we're able to kind of sort of equalize, or whatever the word is, to kind of, balance our expectations, pace ourselves, to understand what we're facing, not, fantasize about ideas that aren't going to be, and also to make the most of the possibility that Trump may become president. And I think that those are both very important things to just talk about for a second. So the first thing is, when the Democratic Party under Biden really has become a party of anti-Semitism, I talked about in my article last Friday how the Biden administration today is advancing a series of blood libels around Israel that demonize the Jewish state and its population and delegitimize our very existence. And there are things like, embracing Hamas's propaganda numbers of casualties and saying that we're killing all these innocent civilians, when in fact, there's the lowest ratio of civilians to military casualties on the Palestinian side that we've ever seen in the history of warfare. It's 1.3 civilians to 1 Hamas terrorist, and that's at sort of the high end. Other assessments have it as less than 1 civilian to Hamas terrorists. For instance, in the operation at Shifa Hospital, not 1 civilian was killed, right? So, Israel has the lowest civilian casualty level in the history of warfare, and yet the administration is maligning us and saying that we're killing too many Palestinian civilians based on Hamas's propaganda numbers. Then you have Samantha Power joining the EU, accusing us of intentionally causing a famine in northern Gaza. This is just a pure lie. It's a total lie. And so, you have an administration that is parroting or resonating the anti-Semitic libels that are being put out by anti-Semites in the Democratic base. But there are also anti-Semites on the Republican base, and the Republican Party is very pro-Israel. But there are a lot of different factions inside of the Republican base, and we have to be aware of that fact. We also have to be aware of the fact that all politicians want to sort of be where the center of gravity of their country is. And so if you have, half of the country that is willing to embrace or at least not condemn anti-Semites in its base, it means that anti-Semitism is also becoming more. In the United States in 2024 is a much more permissive environment for anti-Semitism than it was, say, 8 and 10 and 15 years ago. And I think that's a very important point to make. And so, a Republican looking at the map nationally and not just, my state or your state or whomever, he has to think about those factors as well. And so that's one aspect of it. But I think that here is the most important aspect, which is that Israel has to make the case for Israeli sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. It has to make the case to reject and to discard the canard of the two-state solution. That there is no two-state solution. That you have to choose. You either want an annihilationist, genocidal Palestinian state that will commit genocide of the Jews of Israel, as we saw on October 7th, if given the opportunity, or whenever given the opportunity. We just found a massive cache of Iranian arms that had been smuggled into Judea and Samaria for the purpose of massacring Jews in Judea and Samaria and in Israel's major population centers. And we're talking about anti-tank mines, we're talking about RPGs, we're talking about, thousands of Kalashnikovs. Just massive amounts of arms that were brought into Judea and Samaria for the purpose of massacre, right? And that's what they want. And this is what you'll get if you get a Palestinian state, which is why Trump's former ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, is now coming out with a program that rejects the Palestinian states and calls for Israel to apply its sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, period. Because, if you're going to choose one state over another, if you have to choose, then choose Israel. And I think that Israelis need to make the case very clearly what it is about a Palestinian state that is insufferable, that is unacceptable to Israelis. Why is it that over 70% of Israelis reject Palestinian statehood today? We saw what it is on October 7th. This is what it is. There's been a Palestinian state in Gaza since 2005, and this is what it came up with. A one-day Holocaust. Which, by the way, we saw when it was reported this week, finally exposed that that they had a stage 2 plan of October 7th, that if we hadn't really stopped them in a serious way by 12 noon, then a second wave was supposed to go through. One was supposed to go down to the nuclear reactor at Mona in the Negev, and the other one was supposed to go up to Tel Aviv to conduct further slaughter. This was a suicide mission, particularly to Tel Aviv, by all counts. There's no way that they were going to make it back to Gaza after doing this. But they wanted to kill thousands and thousands more people in Tel Aviv. That was what they wanted. This is who they are, right? This is who they teach their children to be. And so, we have to be able to make the case to people like Trump, who are definitely not anti-Semites and are pro-Israel. This whole idea of peace has to be made without a two-state solution. Make it by rejecting the two-state solution. The peace can't come as a result of a two-state solution. It can only come without one. That's the only way that you can have one. You want to push back Iran, then the way to do it is to push forward Israel, is to stand with Israel. And the final thing that you have to understand when you're looking at the dynamic inside of America, with the rise of anti-Semitism, which I hope gets tamped down and crushed really in the near future, particularly under a Trump presidency. I don't have any expectations at this point from a Biden one, is that Israel, when we're moving forward in our relations, whether with the Democrats or the Republicans, we can't be doing it on the basis of dependency on American munitions and resupply. We need to build a partnership. If the United States wants to disengage, who wouldn't, from the Middle East, then the way that you do it securely is by empowering your allies who share your enemies and who will fight your enemies because they're their enemies. Israel's enemies are America's enemies. So we need to develop a strategic partnership with the United States, not to further deepen our dependence on the United States. I got smashed on Twitter today because I said, we have to cancel our order for another squadron of F-35s. We should be taking our money, we should be taking our resources, and we should put them into developing a missile and unmanned aerial vehicle corps, to match our Air Force, parallel to our Air Force, that is going to be dealing with current and next generation trends. When you look at the war in Ukraine, you see that, the future does not belong to manned flight. It belongs to unmanned flight, whether it's hypersonic missiles that are essentially stealth missiles because they travel so quickly and low, or whether it's unmanned aerial vehicles, which in many cases can replace manned aerial vehicles. And why would you put your future into another squadron or two squadrons of manned fifth-generation fighters when you have other options that are less risky for your people and less expensive, that Israel can become much more self-reliant if we embrace. So, these are the kinds of things that Israelis have to discuss here. But when we're looking forward and we're seeing, we're looking at in America where you actually, you see a very clear choice between Biden and Trump, and there are pluses and minuses to both men. From an Israeli perspective, the pluses on Trump's side are very clear. And what Biden just did to us at the UN Security Council and is doing to us every day in his objection to an Israeli military victory on the other end were very clear. When you take these into consideration, you still see that on both sides you have, some pluses with Biden and you have some minuses with Trump. And Israel, when it navigates this scene, the most important thing to do is to navigate it from a position of strength. And you do that by decreasing our dependence and strengthening the things that make us allies to begin with, which means winning this war first and foremost and moving forward with more strategic independence than we've seen in recent years, and with less of a sense that we need to depend on outside actors, including America, to secure our future. Anyway, those are my thoughts for today. And I'll talk to you again later this week. We also have a really great guest coming up, Patricia Heaton, the actress. Everybody loves Raymond. Everybody loves Patricia because not only is she a fantastic actress, but she's also an extraordinary friend of Israel and of the Jews. And she's got a lot to tell us about what she's doing. So I'm looking forward to talking to her as this week progresses. Take care.